Hello, this is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. Today's show is going to be on the Ukraine war and the march of the authoritarian Russian government. I'm going to be joined with a guest, Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch. Her most recent serving was as the ambassador in the Ukraine, where she spent significant amounts of time helping the Ukraine prepare for what inevitably did happen, which was the war with Russia. She has wonderful insights, including some small piece about what happened to her during the impeachment when she was removed from office and why. But the really fascinating part is her description of why are we even there? Why does the United States, with all the other challenges that we're facing, have any reason to be spending time inside the Ukraine or helping the Ukraine against Russia and what seems to be a building authoritarian government? I think it's a show you'll enjoy. Thanks for being with us. Now I'm going to go over to Ambassador Yovanovitch. Welcome, Ambassador Yovanovitch. I appreciate you being on the show with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor.
All right, so we are going to talk about your book, Lessons from the Edge. And I know that as we're going through this, we're going to have to talk about your bio, and we're going to have to talk about what happened in the impeachment. But in my opinion, you are a real gem to the community. Just understanding what is going on one of the single biggest issues that we're confronting today with Russia and with the Ukraine, to me is really where I'd like to spend and focus most of our time. I think that's an area that our readers, our watchers, can really gain a great deal. So I want to start with what I think is the toughest question, or the hardest one, which I hear from a lot of people, and that is, why are we even there? Why does it matter that we're there? Why does it matter whether or not Russia ends up owning or controlling Ukraine from an American standpoint?
Yeah, so I get that question a lot as well, because it seems like, here's Ukraine. It's so very far away. There's so many priorities out there, domestic priorities, where we need to be focused. There are other foreign policy challenges. Why is there so much focus on Russia's unprovoked war of aggression on Ukraine? And why are we pouring billions of dollars into supporting Ukraine? And I think it's an important question to ask, and it's an important question to answer. And, from my point of view, it's not because we are good people that we are supporting Ukraine, although we are good people and we want to support a plucky little democracy, even if it's very, very far away, that is being pounded by the Russians, that is being terrorized, frankly, by the Russians. When you look at what happens as city after city, town after town is being liberated by the Ukrainian military, and we are discovering all sorts of atrocities that, are just, on the one hand, unimaginable, but on the other hand, they are facts and they are real and they need to be dealt with. So, we want to support Ukraine because it's the right thing to do, because what Russia is doing is wrong. What Russia is doing is invading another sovereign country. They are ignoring international borders that Russia itself has recognized many times over in various treaties and agreements. They are violating human rights in many cases, and they are decimating a democracy, or trying to decimate a democracy. But all of those things are not why we are actually supporting Ukraine. We are supporting Ukraine because it is in our national security interests. Putin has told us repeatedly in writings and in his actions that he has very grandiose ambitions to recreate the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, however you want to look at that. He believes that Ukraine is not a sovereign country, that the Ukrainians are not a separate people, but his ambitions go way beyond just Ukraine. He's talking about other countries as well, some of which are in NATO. And if you think about that, and if you think about a world where Putin prevails in Ukraine and continues his marauding escapades, we will be in a world where might makes right, where he is empowered to continue to do what he wants to do, and little countries have to put up with it. Where other dictators are also feeling encouraged and empowered that they can do this because the little countries are on their own. Other countries will not stand up for the international principles that have guided international relations since World War II and have kept the world a safer, more democratic, and more prosperous place than at any other time, frankly, in human history. I'm not saying that where we are today is a perfect place, because it's not, but it is better than it was before World War II and arguably any time before that. And we, we are in charge. We can of our own destinies, and we can make the world, in my view, a better place. But not if Vladimir Putin gets to set the rules. Not if he's the one who says this is the way the international order is going to be. I mean, imagine, if you're a business person, imagine what it would do to our international supply chains. We've already seen significant disruption. But if Putin and his ilk are in charge, I think you're going to see a lot more. Imagine what it would do to the security and safety, really, of every American if somebody who is loosely talking about nuclear threats and other kinds of provocations, is the one who is setting kind of the agenda and the rules by which we all live by. That's not in U.S. interests. And it doesn't make us a freer and more democratic world or country. And so the reason that we are so focused on what is happening in Ukraine is that we cannot allow Vladimir Putin to prevail. Back in 2008, he invaded Georgia. He carved off 2 chunks of Georgia. Back in 2014, he started in on Ukraine, illegally annexed Crimea, and continued in the Donbass, this kind of low-level war where 3 or 4 people died every week, usually soldiers, often civilians as well. And then, he got away with both of those things. And then in February of this year, he started a major, large-scale invasion of Ukraine. And we are standing up. The international community, under the leadership of the United States and President Biden, is standing up and saying no, and putting really harsh punitive sanctions on Russia. And of course, providing security assistance in an unprecedented way to Ukraine. And Ukraine is making the most of it. I mean, President Zelensky has said, you give us the arms and we'll do the fighting. I mean, that's a pretty good deal for the United States.
I agree. So let me take this even one level deeper. I know that you have an incredible amount of history. The story about your parents, I think, is an amazing and somewhat beautiful story. But there's this new American international relativism that seems to be going on from my standpoint. It's this thought that there are no absolute truths. Why is it that we're better than them? Why is it that we're any different than Russia or China? They just have a different point of view. It's more focused on the collective. We're more focused on the individual. You spent a lot of time at the State Department. Do you think that the values of the United States are part of what drives people who work inside the State Department and our intelligence agencies, and for that matter, you yourself? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think absolutely. People who are called to service, whether it's in the military, whether it's in our intelligence agencies, whether it's at the State Department or other agencies, or, in your local towns and states, people who are called to service do it because we believe we want to give back. We want to serve the American people. We want to add value to our communities, our countries, and the world. And for me, having parents who grew up in totalitarian regimes, my mother in Nazi Germany, my father in what was then Yugoslavia, preceding World War II and during World War II, they came to the United States and they did not take freedom for granted. They did not take the rights and the privileges and the freedoms that we have for granted. They wanted to worship as they pleased. They wanted to be able to express themselves as they pleased. They wanted to have the freedom to create a better life for my brother and myself. And they were able to accomplish that in the United States. And I think, for many years, that is what has driven many other immigrants, but also people who are born in the United States, And, that call to service, we think of the greatest generation in World War II and in other eras. But I think more recently, I know I have come to take some of those freedoms and our democracy for granted, and not realize that, our institutions are strong and resilient, but they're only as strong and resilient as the people who actually inhabit them and work in them and preserve and protect and defend them and work for the American people. And so all of us, no matter who you are in the United States, we all have responsibility to, build bridges to other communities, to build trust, and to, to work to strengthen our society, our democracy. And that doesn't mean that you have to join the military or something. It can mean, joining the library board and working on the beautification committee for your local town. All of these things are public goods that, make our communities stronger and better. I always tell young people who I talk to, what's your passion? What are you most interested in? Follow that passion, because you will be good at what you do. You will enjoy it, and you will bring, added good to that. And so, some people are called to military service. Other people are called, to religious service. Other people are called to volunteer in their communities with the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts. That is, back in the day, in the 1800s, a Frenchman by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a famous book on American democracy. And what he talked about was civil society, which is not a term we really use in the United States very much, because it is a part of who we are. Civil society is all of us. It's all of the organizations that are volunteering groups that are out there creating the warp and the weft of American society. And it's what makes us so strong.
Yeah, Tocqueville was amazed by what he saw here. Right now, the Russia.
Could I just add one more point here to this? We were talking about the United States, but I was just in Ukraine about 3 weeks ago for a conference. And the purpose of the conference was to, for people to exchange ideas, but also to show that you could have an international conference in the heart of Ukraine, in the capital, and to express support for Ukraine, all of which was accomplished. But, when I talk to people, not only, the government officials who were part of the conference and so forth, but also, just friends and former employees at the U.S. Embassy and so forth. What really came across to me was how Ukraine also exemplifies that ideal of, civil society that de Tocqueville was talking about. Ukraine today is completely different than it was, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, because it is a completely mobilized society, not in the sense of President Zelensky, sort of waving a magic wand or issuing an edict and saying, you're going to do this task and you're going to do something else, but in the sense that everybody in Ukrainian society is showing courage, is showing commitment, and is showing confidence that they are going to win. And the reason they're confident is that each of them is doing something for the greater cause. Some people are fighting, some people are driving ambulances, some people are bringing food to their elderly neighbor next door who maybe can't get out, and some of the services are, no longer working in that particular town. Many of the people that I used to work with in Ukraine are civil society leaders and are often traveling to Washington, to Berlin, to Paris, to share with our leaders and our, their counterparts, what is going on in Ukraine and what is, what kind of assistance is necessary and how things are going. So they're passing the word, as kind of first person testimonials. It's very powerful to see what a completely mobilized society can do. They are fighting, not always literally, but fighting for a free Ukraine. And it is really inspiring.
Yeah, it's funny. My view of this is, if you look back at what made the United States great, certainly we have some big advantages. Our geography, the fact that we have a Pacific Ocean on one side, the Atlantic on another, our demographics are great. the institutions that you talked about. But the single greatest thing that I think that our government ever did was empower the individual over itself. And by doing that, it is amazing how we distributed the ability to solve big problems of human progress. We distribute it to the private sector. We distribute it to not-for-profits. We distribute it to individuals working out of their garages. And that has, in fact, created the greatest period in our entire history where we've moved human progress forward. What I'm worried about today is we look at not only Russia, but we see what's going on with China. We have these two authoritarian governments who are very focused not only on the collective, but the belief that the collective can only be served by having a political party that is dominant over it, or an oligarchy that is dominant over it. And so at the end of the day, their systems really aren't about the collective. They seem to be more about power. But what I'm worried about, I know the United States is in a great position economically over them, but you have these two powers that now seem to be bent on kind of the same course. Are we entering a new Cold War, and is this something Americans should be worried about?
It's hard to sort of make that definitive statement at this point, but I think that this is a time of great challenge. It's a time when I would say that this is the greatest challenge, certainly in my lifetime. And, when we look back on it, going back to your first question, when we look back on this 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we're not going to look back on this as, what happened in Ukraine, as much as I personally love Ukraine and am very attached to many individuals there. We're going to look back on it as, how did we handle a time when the role of the United States, the American century, is changing? Bill Burns, who is now head of the CIA, talks about the new U.S. role as being a pivotal power, not the superpower that's out there, but the pivotal power that can, influence and mold and kind of has the last word in how things go. Still, a very, very dominant power, but not the only power out there. And you have obviously countries like Russia and China, but you also have many other powers out there that are clamoring for a seat at the table. And, you look at the UN and the distribution of power there, and many countries think it's extremely unfair. And it is. And so I was pleased to see that President Biden called for a reform of the UN Security Council so that it can more accurately, shall we say, reflect the world today as opposed to the world of 1945, and perhaps be a more effective international body. But yes, I think we are in a time of great challenge, and we need to be nimble and creative and open to how to move forward. And I wish I could give you the blueprint. I wish I had the answers for how we do that. But I think that there are a lot of challenges, and they intertwine. It's not just about countries wanting more power or more say. It's also about, the big challenges like, climate change. We just saw the hurricane in Florida, probably the biggest disaster in Florida's history. And there's so many other challenges out there as well. And how do we approach this, not only as a nation, but as an international community of countries, to make, the planet, not to sound all, doe-eyed, but to make the planet a better place for all of us.
So I was on a call the other day listening to Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey takes the position that first, that the United States interfered in trying to draw them away unfairly during a period of time he was there. I don't know if that was during the Revolution of Dignity or the Orange Revolution, but some period of time that he was there. But more importantly,
are you talking about Ukraine or Russia?
That we did that with Ukraine, in Ukraine. In any event, Jeffrey's main point that he made in the call was that we really shouldn't actively be involved at all in the Ukraine, that we should be working something out with Russia. And when you parsed apart the two speakers' thoughts, it really kind of broke down to this. The individual who was more supportive of the United States being there, her position was, we run a huge risk if we don't stop them now. And his issue was, we run a big risk of nuclear thermal warfare if we do. When you weigh out those two things, how do you see both of those risks, and how do you think that we should land when we're making a decision to further our involvement?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing I would say is that, this sort of the realpolitik that Russia is the greater power, and so that's where our real interests lie, and that's where our national security interests lie. That Ukraine is a smaller country, although it is the largest country in Europe, I would just add, and that we don't really have interests there. But here's the thing, that kind of philosophy of realpolitik might have worked in the 1800s and maybe even the early 1900s. But today, in the era of social media and what we were just talking about, where individuals are empowered and groups are empowered, it isn't all just about governments and governments working out their special deals together. Ukraine is never going to be that compliant country, even if we pull out all international support, and the Ukrainian military somehow collapses and Russia gets its way with Ukraine. That's not going to be the stable country that Russia rules and everything goes forward in a really great way, because the people of Ukraine get a voice and a vote in this. They may not get a vote under Putin, but they will certainly have a voice. And there will be, it will be an unstable country until their will, in the modern age, is respected. So, you look back over the last 30 years of independence, Ukraine in 1991 overwhelmingly voted for independence, including in the so-called Russian areas of Crimea and the Donbass, overwhelmingly voted for independence from the Soviet Union. There have been two revolutions that also, expressed a desire to live by Western values, less corruption, more freedoms, more prosperity, et cetera. Most people don't talk about these things, either in the United States or in Ukraine as we want democracy and market capitalism. They talk about it as, I want to be secure in my life. And that means that I have a good job and can take care of my family, that my kids have a good future here, that I can, walk safely down the street, there's, crime is under control, and that I can vote for the person I want to vote for. And if that person doesn't do a good job, I can vote that person out of office. And what that is, and again, democracy, not a perfect system. Capitalism, not a perfect system, but the best system that we've discovered so far to deliver those things that most people, I think, in the world want, and certainly Ukrainians want. And so Ukrainians have fought two revolutions for that very same thing. And now, in 1415, they started fighting the war against the Russians. And of course, now they are fighting, to the finish, to be able to live in a free country. So I don't think that, if the US and Russia cut a deal behind Ukraine's back, I don't think that's going to deliver what Russia and Jeffrey Sachs think they're going to get. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is, the way Russia is bandying about the use, the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is, has to be taken seriously. It is very frightening. But, when I think about it, I don't think that if we said, okay, we're gonna give you what you want because you're threatening nuclear war. I don't think that means that Putin is going to say, okay, now I'm not going to threaten nuclear war. He's going to pocket whatever we give him, whatever Ukraine gives him, and then he's going to continue because he sees that we are self-deterred. So I think that, Ukraine has no choice but to continue to fight on, because if this is an existential war. you, Putin has said the Ukrainian people do not exist. Ukraine does not exist as a country separate from Russia. And we've seen what he's done in the occupied areas of Ukraine. So the Ukrainian people have no choice but to continue to fight on and prevail. And I don't think that we have a choice either, because if Putin is successful in Ukraine, he's going to continue with those methods, not only in all of Ukraine, but beyond. And that does not make for a safer world for Americans. So, I guess I would be with the other speaker in terms of which way to go.
All right, so the role that our military plays, the role that we play from providing strength, and also the role that we play from providing diplomacy. How do we balance this out if there is going to be a solution? Do we need to give Vladimir Putin some ability to save face, or do we just need to hope that they drive him completely out?
Yeah, so we have been providing those options from the very beginning. I don't know if you recall when Russian forces were completely surrounding Ukraine before the war actually started. And there were a series of meetings in Europe where we provided all sorts of, the Russians had said, we're concerned about this, we're concerned about NATO expansion, we're concerned about various arms control treaties, et cetera, et cetera. And the US and NATO provided substantive responses. And there was actually even a meeting about it. But the Russians actually, those were all, kind of red herrings to sort of distract us because they didn't sort of say, okay, great, you're ready to talk about these things. Let's sit down and talk and kind of work through some of these things. They were not interested at all. They had a plan to invade Ukraine, all of Ukraine, and they were sticking to it. And those diplomatic negotiations before the war, and then in the first couple of months with the Ukrainians after the invasion started, that was just to divert us and to eat up time. So I think, Russia has always had choices, looking back over the decades of independence, and even before for that matter. And Putin has not chosen to take the path of, reaching across and taking the offered hand and finding mutual solutions that would make not only the world a better place, but I think, be better for Russia as well. He's not taken those options. He still has that option today, but he's not taking it. What he wants to do is very clear. He wants to create the facts on the ground through fighting, through the illegal annexation, the referendum and the illegal annexation of, 4 oblasts that he does not control, and through various other mechanisms to create either the facts or the illusion on the ground that gives him a stronger position when ultimately there will be diplomatic negotiations to end this war. And, again, Putin could end this today.
So where do you see the status of the war effort today?
Well, I think that, Ukraine is winning. It's pretty clear. I'm not a military person, of course, as you know, but all my military colleagues say that, it's hard to see how Russia reverses the situation on the ground because, just today we heard new news that both in the south, in the Kherson area, and in the east, in the Donbass area, that Ukraine has liberated more towns. Russian soldiers are being encircled. They continue to be pushed back as well. And they are being cut off from critical hubs, transportation hubs, and therefore from resupply. So, there's that old Napoleonic saying that an army marches on its feet, but modern armies, on its stomach, excuse me. Modern armies not only march on their stomach, they also, need all that resupply of weapon systems and ammunition. And if that's not getting to soldiers, then it's hard to keep on fighting.
So in the military folks that you speak to, what's their view if Russia does truly mobilize, if they're able to implement a draft, if they're able to get 300,000 soldiers to the front? What are their views of the steps that Vladimir Putin seems to be taking today?
Yeah. Well, most of the people that I talk to seem to think this is going to take a really long time, because when you think about how long now maybe some of these people have military experience and can be put right in, but most of them, I think, probably don't. And frankly, historically, the Russian military is not big on training, right? They draft people, they have them, do desultory tasks, but they're not a big, lean, mean fighting machine, as we have seen over the last several months. And so, the skill set is not really there, and it will take a long time to build up that skill set. And the other issue that, frankly, I don't think we paid a lot of attention to, or at least maybe I didn't think about enough before, was just, the fighting spirit, the motivation. It's clear that the Russian military does not have that. And, when you see a draft for 300,000, followed then by 200,000 Russians leaving the country, that's also a fact on the ground. It's hard to see how Russia moves forward in this environment. Although the Russians, over the centuries have, thrown their soldiers into battle without training, often without weapons, and just frankly as cannon fodder, and they could continue to do that. But that's not a winning strategy.
Right. So you talked about a moment ago if Russia begins to win, the effect that it would have on authoritarian governments, small dictators, and others, empowering them around the world. Do you think the opposite would be true? Do you think that if they failed, that there might be an effect on rogue nations like Iran, Hamas, the Syrians, and others? And maybe if you could expand on that, what effect do you think would happen if Russia were actually not to succeed, assuming that we don't end up with any type of nuclear conflict?
Yeah, and that's, that is a concern, as we stated before. And I would just add one more thing about that, at least to date, our authorities are saying that they haven't seen the kind of activity that they would expect to see if tactical nukes were being, brought to the fore. So that's one positive, one little silver lining in this. The other thing is, Russia and the United States, or the Soviet Union and the United States, managed the Cold War with nuclear weapons and many, flashpoints successfully during the Cold War. And so I'm hoping that, if that is indeed where we're going here, that we can do the same now. We know how to manage these things. The Russians do too. We don't think the Russians are suicidal. We know we're not. And so I'm hopeful that we can manage things. Although, again, as I said before, this is a time of great challenge. But yeah, I think that if Russia does not prevail, and we saw the meeting of the CSTO several weeks ago, where both China and India publicly kind of chastised Putin. And, they hadn't been doing that before, but they did that after the losses in the east of Ukraine. And so I don't think that's coincidental. I think they probably would have kept quiet if Russia was winning. But it's pretty clear Russia is losing now, and not clear how it can regain the momentum. So I think, I think countries are going to take stock of that. They're going to have to think about how they manage their own ambitions and their relations with other countries, and think about the international system. And there's no question that the international rules-based order that we've lived under since 1945, the end of World War II, needs reform. And so let's do that rather than engage in these kinds of wars that bring needless killing and tragedy to so many families in so many countries, and the instability that causes as well. I think, I think it's also got to have an effect on the Russians' arms business, because you're seeing that, the Russians' weapon systems are not nearly as effective as we had thought they were. That's a big export for Russia. And you've got a lot of countries around the world who have been buying from Russia and may have to rethink some of that. So I think there are going to be many knock-on effects, any way you slice it, from what we're seeing today.
So have you been able to meet with Zelensky since this started?
No, I have not.
All right. So if you would, give me, we have a little bit of time here, and I know that we're kind of going back almost to the beginning, but I thought it was important that we start with the question of why. Why are we there? You have an incredible history here. Your book, Lessons from the Edge, is a beautiful book. I really did enjoy reading it. But if you would, give us a little bit of both the history of Ukraine, how we ended up here, the different revolutions that took place, why they took place, and the role that you played in it, and how you got there.
Yeah. So I think, as I said before, back in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, the Ukrainians voted by 93%, I think it was, for independence from the Soviet Union. And through various elections, through two revolutions, they voted for a Western future, in the sense that they wanted a less corruption, more freedom, not only political freedoms, but also economic freedoms, to take care of their families and provide a good future for their children. And they saw the path to that as being closer to Europe, closer to the EU. And now with Vladimir Putin's actions, both in 2014, 2015, continuing, and now in 2022, there are overwhelming majorities that want to join the EU and even want to join NATO, something that would have been unthinkable before. So it's pretty clear where the Ukrainian people are, and it's really important as we look forward to rebuilding the peace, shall we say, rebuilding the economy, that Ukraine's leaders understand that. The Ukrainian people right now, whether it's the military or civil society, they're fighting for that future that is more Western oriented. And I don't think they're going to tolerate oligarchs or a political elite that is siphoning money out of government coffers, out of the billions that will be necessary for rebuilding Ukraine. And I think it's really important that the Ukrainian leadership understand that and act by it, and that as we, the international community, assist Ukraine in rebuilding, that we hold them to that standard through conditionality. The EU is already doing this. They're really leaning into the idea of membership for Ukraine, but saying, you need to do certain 5 reforms, actually. You need to do these 5 reforms that have to do with good governance, corruption, reforming the court system, and so forth. And I think that's important because it provides a real incentive for Ukraine to do those important reforms, which are good not only for the people living in that country, but also for businesses. Because if you don't have an independent court system, if somebody can call in the verdict they want and grease the skids with money, what international investor wants to invest in a country like that? It's just too fraught. And what, for that matter, domestic companies want to build their future in a country like that. So I think, waging the war is very challenging. Building the peace might be just as challenging, but in different ways. And it's important to get that right, too.
Is conditionality controversial at all in the Ukraine, or is that something that tends to be supported?
I think it depends on who you talk to. Looking back to when I was there, on the one hand, many Ukrainians felt that it was the international community dictating what Ukraine did or didn't do. But actually, they were agreements. We said we would provide a certain amount of assistance, either monetarily or in kind, which is usually the U.S. does the latter. and there's an agreed plan of action. And following 2014, the groups that were at the table were, of course, the Ukrainian government first and foremost, the international donors, and also civil society, because civil society had been working towards these goals, and they had, much of it was legislation, enabling legislation and regulations, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they had prepared many of the plans. And so Ukraine wasn't starting from nothing in 2014, because they had been working on these things, again, with Western assistance for many years.
Yeah, it was my time in Poland, I just found to be fascinating. I went there with the State Department to talk to them about forming local governments for the first time when communism fell, and they went from everything being centralized to things being localized. It was amazing how they wanted to focus on things like where do you build the barber shop as opposed to property rights, or they wanted to focus on, how can they spend more money on water treatment plants as opposed to figuring out how do you create the robust economy that's going to make things work. And it just was a challenge in the thinking because they were shifting over from something dramatic. So in your time in the Ukraine, you had to spend a lot of time talking about corruption and those types of issues. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was very much a focus, the 2014 revolution of dignity, as it's called. I mean, what that meant was, I want to live according to the rule of law, which is that you and I are under the same law. You don't get, special benefits because you're president, or because you're an oligarch, or because you're, bribing somebody. It's all one law for everybody. And the Ukrainian people were just sick of the corruption of the Yanukovych government, and they threw him out. And so the incoming Poroshenko government knew that it had to move forward with reforms, particularly focused on anti-corruption, and made some important headway. But you know how things are. It's never a straight line with these things. And so it was, one step forward, 2 steps back, 1.5 steps forward. And so, it continues to be a work in progress. And Zelensky has continued that work. Obviously, there are some challenges now with the war.
So at the end of your time there, what began to happen with the administration that created the conflict and that caused you to leave? And I don't want to spend much time on this, but I think it's important to spend a few moments on it.
Well, so I think that the president's personal lawyer, former Mayor Rudy Giuliani, was looking for what he was hoping to find some dirt on then Vice President, former Vice President Biden and his son Hunter in Ukraine. And he hooked up with the corrupt prosecutor general who, had come in on a reform agenda, but then proceeded to do the exact opposite and didn't like the role the U.S. was taking in terms of continuing to advocate for reform, including in his offices. And that person wanted me gone. And so I think there was a little bit of, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. If you get rid of the ambassador, then I'll help you with all sorts of, cases against Hunter Biden, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It never came to anything, but the prosecutor general did get his ambition that I was removed from my post.
All right. So in looking back on it, I have 2 last questions for you. The first one is this. The men and women that work for the State Department, intelligence, the people you interacted with, both in intelligence and the military, how should Americans view them?
As patriots? I'm not really sure what the thrust of your question.
I think sometimes they end up being framed as the deep state. In fact, you're probably framed as the deep state. I'm not always sure what the deep state means. That could be a derogatory term or not necessarily a derogatory term, depending upon how you want to frame it. But I think sometimes Americans just don't have an appreciation for the work that's being done on their behalf by so many different Americans. And I just know that in the role that you were in, you had to deal with a lot of people. And I'd just love to have your opinions of the people who were there? Obviously that they were patriots, but when you walked away from it, were you inspired by them? Are you encouraged by them? Are you worried about new people that you see coming in? What's your view of it today?
I am inspired by my colleagues, my former colleagues. Over the weekend, I was at a social event with a number of people who had previously served in Ukraine. And it was, we had all left Ukraine, but many of them, well, most of them are still working for their various agencies. And almost all of them have volunteered to go back to Ukraine or are working on various task forces because they want to help. They see this as the test of our times and they want to contribute. And they see it, I think, not only as helping Ukraine, a democracy, realize its own ambitions, but they see it as in the national security interests of the United States and the American people, that this is the most critical test of our times, and they want to provide added value in terms of protecting and defending the American people. And so sometimes you can see that, it's easy with the military because you see the photo of, an F-16 or an F-35 or something like that. It's harder when you've got people who are in back offices and doing all of the work that it takes to provide supplies to Ukraine, or people at the State Department and DoD who are doing negotiations with Ukraine, with the Russians, with the Europeans on all of these things. All of that is to protect the American people. That is our number one goal, is to advance the interests of the American people and to protect the American people. And, when I talk to young people, they're like, well, knowing everything you know now, would you still join the State Department? And I say yes, because it is a great career where you can make a difference every day. You can serve the American people, and it's just inspiring to be with a group of people who want to raise a flag and defend our values.
So if you could do it all over again, you'd do it.
Absolutely.
All right. So last question. With everything that you see that's going on with Russia, China, what you saw from your diplomatic experience, and then what you see going on here at home, would you say that you're optimistic or pessimistic about where we're going as a country?
So domestically here in the United States, we also face great challenges, and it's because we are so divided. There is a lack of trust, I think, between and among various communities. And, I come back to what I said before, which is that we need to build bridges. We need to learn how to trust each other again, so that we can disagree, because, disagreement is it's kind of what democracies are all about, right? Where you debate points and you vote for different people and different parties and so forth, where you can disagree and you can come to some sort of reasonable solution to whatever the various problems are. But over time, it's become not just disagreement, but a belief that if somebody disagrees, they are somehow disloyal. And, I think that comes from the fact that we have social media and very stovepiped media groups and so forth. So the information that I'm getting may not be the same information that you're getting. And, facts are a little bit fungible, and we need to get a handle on that to educate not only our children, but ourselves about, what the facts are as opposed to what opinions are, and how to tell the difference and how to drive an argument forward in a constructive way that doesn't destroy friendships and partnerships, but actually builds trust and builds the future.
In my experience, I spent a lot of time in politics and government and in business. The public that I'm talking to, they're exhausted by the negative information that they're being given. There's no doubt there's still these two groups on each side, but I argue that it's really about 5% of the population on each extreme, maybe 10% total. The overwhelming majority of people want this country to work. And I just want to say this about your experience. I know when you left, that had to be somewhat distasteful, but there was somewhat of a hidden gift in that. And that is that we got to know you. We got to hear your story. We got to hear what was going on in Ukraine. Oftentimes, the people who work in the State Department, intelligence agencies, and others, we really never get to see them. We never get to understand their story. Keep telling that story. It's a beautiful story. It's one that not only speaks to me about what's important in Ukraine, but it's about the wonderful people who oftentimes work for us that we just don't give enough credit to and pay enough attention to. So, Ambassador Yovanovitch, thank you so much for your service. Thanks for being on our show. I'm humbled by it, but I want you to know that we really appreciate all that you've done.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now, help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.